I would like to introduce Jocelyn Bosley. She is the Assistant Director for Education and Outreach at the Materials Research Science and Engineering Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is also my frequent collaborator and partner in crime. So I will leave it to you, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much, Kiyomi. I'm so glad you're my moderator. And thank you everyone who has come to this talk this morning at the end of the third day of a long and fantastic conference. Everyone see my screen okay? Thumbs up? Okay, I hear no complaining, so I will continue. So as Kiyomi mentioned, I am the Assistant Director for Education and Outreach for the Materials Research Science and Engineering Center, affectionately known as MERSEC, here at the University of Nebraska. And I wear many hats and assume many roles in that capacity. A little bit about my background. I studied math and science as an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska, and my graduate degrees are actually in the history of science. So that historical perspective really informs the way I work in and think about and approach science education and science communication. And as I think you'll see, it also informs how I think about what I'm calling the strange, sticky politics of expertise, and really the problem of expertise. And you'll see as we go along why I think expertise is and has become a bit of a problem. Part of the solution, I think, is, let's advance the slide, storytelling. And this is a theme that is not new to you if you have been attending other talks at this conference. It's a theme that has cut across many of the different talks, including my Science with Friends co-host, Brad Nordell, who you just heard from in this very Zoom room. And so I want to say a little something about what this talk is not. It is not a talk about the reasons and the research why storytelling is a particularly powerful and effective tool for science communication. That's a really important talk, and it's a talk that is best given by Liz Neely of the Story Collider. So we've actually hosted her at the University of Nebraska and talked with her about this, and she has a really robust understanding of all of the research showing why narrative formats are compelling and effective ways to communicate scientific content. And you can check that out. Check out her lecture on YouTube. Kiyomi's been great about putting links in the chat, so I bet she can find this and put the link in the chat. On YouTube, you can watch her lecture called The Power of Personal Stories About Science. And you can also check out our interview with her on the Science with Friends podcast, which, as you may have heard, I co-host with our previous speaker, Brad Nordell. So we talked with Liz on the podcast about the art and science of science communication. And she is really the master when it comes to her grasp of the research and the literature showing why and how storytelling is particularly effective. So I'm not going to do that in this talk. What I do want to do is provide sort of a framework, a philosophical orientation almost, toward science communication, and specifically how storytelling can be used to deal with the problem of expertise that we're now facing in society. So I'm going to briefly unshare my screen because it only seems fitting that if I am telling you a story about storytelling, I ought to begin with a true storytelling moment. So I'm going to tell you a story about the origin of this talk. And it goes back, believe it or not, almost 20 years to the very, very first graduate seminar that I took as a first-year graduate student in the history of science at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And this seminar was memorable for a number of reasons. First, it was co-taught with the University of Minnesota. And this was in the bad old days before Skype and Zoom and things like this were very commonplace. And so we had to meet in a special room on campus that was used for teleconferencing. And everyone, when they spoke, had to speak into one of those skinny little black microphones like they have at congressional hearings. So, you had to lean forward and speak into the microphone like you were testifying before Congress every time you wanted to say something in the discussion. So it's rather intimidating for a first-year, brand new graduate student. It was also memorable because the first meeting of that seminar was on September 4th, 2001, which means that the second meeting of that seminar was on September 11th, 2001. So really a hinge point in the history of the world as I've experienced it. The world changed right as I was embarking on my graduate education, and specifically this seminar. And the topic of the seminar has just become more and more and more relevant to me since then. And it was the history of expertise and democracy. And that's a topic that was interesting to me at the time, but I can't tell you how many times since then, in the couple of decades since I took this seminar, I've wished I could go back and take it again, because it has just seemed more and more and more relevant. And so this is a question that's plagued me. How do we reconcile the notion of expertise, the status of experts as having privileged access to knowledge, and scientific knowledge in particular, but it could be other areas of knowledge too, with democratic values? And I want to be clear that I'm not saying there's any intrinsic conflict between expertise and democracy, because I think we all can agree that there's not. But at the same time, there seems to be a pervasive tension in how people interpret what those things mean. And that has been, I think, coming to a head in recent years and months and weeks and days. So this is a question that's plagued me for a long time. And when I was invited to be a featured speaker at SciComm back in January or February, I thought, well, the thing you do when a question has plagued you for decades and you haven't come up with a satisfactory answer for it is you volunteer to give a talk on the subject. Because that just sort of forces the issue, you know, you gotta figure out something to say about it, some way to grapple with it and make sense of it. So that's what I did. I put together an abstract and promised that I was going to give a talk on this subject that has just nagged at me for almost 2 decades. And that was in January or February. When the conference approached in March, by this time the COVID-19 pandemic was really widespread and the mis and disinformation about it was really starting to take over. And so I was thinking, wow, I mean, I knew this topic was relevant, but now it's even more relevant than it was before. So this is really good timing for this topic. And then the SciComm conference was postponed, as you know, until the meeting that we're having right now virtually. And in those intervening months, it went from seeming, oh wow, this is a great topic to be talking about right now, this is really relevant, to seeming crushingly relevant. And the process of sorting through my feelings and thoughts about it grew even more complex and fraught than it was before. And so I have to say that this is a talk that's going to raise more questions than it provides answers. But I think that's okay. I hope what it does is clarify some of the questions that we should be asking and the issues that we should be grappling with as we approach science communication, and particularly as it pertains to this problem of expertise. Now, I keep calling it a problem, so I'm going to provide some evidence for you from social media that it is in fact a problem. And at this point, I'm going to reshare my screen. So I've seen things like this circulating on social media, and I've been saving them. I have a folder now in my Dropbox called Expertise, and it has all sorts of screenshots of things like this, and they've been piling up over the past few months. So here's one. Rand Paul at the Senate coronavirus hearing said, "We shouldn't presume that a group of experts somehow knows what's best for everyone." And finally, Stevie Berryman says, "One of the most dangerous ideas that has come about in the last 3 years, that I would argue that it is in fact much longer than that, but certainly it's become more evident in the last 3 years, is that all points of view are equally valid, and that the average citizen, you, are just as equipped to judge which have merit as anyone else. Hear all sides and judge for yourself. No, I do not condone the death of expertise, and neither should you." I don't know if expertise is dying. I don't know if it's in crisis, but it's certainly experiencing some challenges right now. And we're seeing that with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other things like vaccinations and climate change. So COVID-19 is not the only example, but it's certainly a very salient one right now. And she concluded this post by saying, "Genuinely smart people look for answers from people who are smarter than themselves. Only ignorant people believe their guess is as good as anyone else's." So it's not that I don't understand and relate to the sentiment, but I think that that is not a very effective way to engage people in conversation, certainly to change anybody's minds. And the problem with that is that it plays into everyone's fears about expertise and what it means. In particular, it invites the response. So this is not the kind of dynamic that you're trying to set up as you're trying to persuade people and instill trust in science and in expertise. In particular, I think what we're seeing is something like this example. These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane? There was a time, not too long ago actually, that I would have thought, rather than plane flying, that medical experts would be the example that nobody would question medicine and doctors. And in a recent election, I was on a bus overhearing a conversation that I, of course, did not insert myself into, but I overheard somebody saying about a candidate, they have no political experience. They're not a politician. And that's refreshing. And I was thinking inside my head, oh, okay, so the next time you want to have surgery, should we get in somebody who has no surgical background because they're not part of the surgical establishment? And that would be refreshing. And at that time, a couple years ago, to me, that seemed like so obviously no one would question that. And everyone would go, well, of course you want to train surgeon. Of course you want to train medical practitioner. Now that's begun to crumble as well. So we're in a very different place than we were even a couple of years ago. I think the pilot example is a pretty good one. But what it shows is that the way people are thinking of expertise is as a form of elitism. And this is kind of, it's a populist sentiment that we have seen rise and fall throughout history, but we're definitely seeing it now. We're seeing it as it applies to science and scientific expertise particularly. So we as science communicators, the responsibility really falls to us to address and try to ameliorate this sense that scientific experts are somehow elitist just because they are experts and they are claiming to have expert knowledge of a subject. And so the good news is that we also have the tools and the power as science communicators to address and help to mitigate this impression. I'm going to go over a few of those tools with you now. I've picked out 4 words that I think we should keep in our minds as we think about how to deal with the problem of expertise in our science communication efforts. And I have a little earworm to go along with each one of them to help you remember them because they're not alliterative. They don't have that going for them. There's 4 of them, not 3. And we know from stories that 3 is the right number of everything. So I should have had 3 words, but I just couldn't contain myself. I have to have 4. So to aid your memory, I've got a little earworm to go along with each one of them. And here are the 4 words. This is how we do it. Process. Complexity. Had to do it. Respect. And what do you mean by that? So at this point, those of you in the audience fall into 2 groups. There are people who are not fans of Jesus Christ Superstar and are going, what was that? And people who are fans of Jesus Christ Superstar and are frantically checking to make sure you're still muted because you just finished saying, that is not an answer. So anyway, these are the 4 words that I want us to keep in mind. Process, complexity, respect, and meaning. And I'm going to walk briefly, more briefly than I would like to, through each one of these and tell you how I think it's important to how we communicate science in a way that will overcome or circumvent this attitude that experts are elitist. So we'll start with process. This is how we do it. Many, most all of you, I'm sure, have seen and heard this quote from President Trump in a press conference on April 23rd. And many, most all of you, I'm sure, found it troubling. There are many things to be troubled by in this quote, but as I reflected on it, I have to tell you that the part that troubled me the most was actually this last line. So it would be interesting to check that. And the reason that I kept coming back to this line is that I was thinking, what would checking that look like? What kind of an understanding or lack of understanding of the scientific process is behind making this kind of a claim and then saying, so it would be interesting to check that. And as I reflected on it further, I realized that there are really two myths about the scientific process that underscored that moment that we all saw and were very troubled by. Um, the first is the myth of the lone genius. So the idea that anybody, with scientific training or not, any single person would stand up at a podium and say, oh, here's an idea I bet nobody's thought of, you should check that. This is not how science works. We know this. Science is intensely collaborative. And in fact, many of the people you might think of as examples of exceptions who fit the lone genius model, if you're thinking of Newton or Darwin or Einstein, they were actually great synthesizers, and that was their genius. So they weren't lone at all. They were building upon and synthesizing the work of many, many different people. So even in those examples, rather than running counter to, they actually highlight the collaborative nature of science. And then the second myth is the myth of serendipitous discovery. When I call it a myth, I'm not saying that it's never happened. Obviously, the mold and penicillin comes readily to mind. So there are such a thing as serendipitous discoveries, but even those discoveries that you might call serendipitous take place within a framework, a system of science. So the scientific process is highly systematic. And I think both of these myths play in to the idea that anybody's opinion can be just as good as anybody else's. And why do we believe these myths? Partly, I think it's because we think they make better stories. The story of the lone genius, the story of the serendipitous discovery, these are following familiar models for stories that we tell a lot. And so they resonate with people and people remember them. But the ironic thing about this is that it overlooks the elements of science that make it so powerful and so unique as a way to generate knowledge. So the collaborative and systematic nature of science is precisely where science gets its power from. So when we tell stories that celebrate a lone genius or a serendipitous discovery, we're actually undercutting the authority of science. We're eliding, we're leaving out the source of science's power. And so it's really important as we think about the kinds of stories that we tell about science, that we figure out ways to tell stories that highlight the collaborative and systematic nature of the scientific process, I think. And why does it matter whether people understand the process of science anyway? Well, I would contend that those who understand science as an ongoing process will recognize and appreciate the knowledge it produces, even when they don't fully understand its content. So content knowledge, that can come, that can admit of degrees. But if you understand the process of science, and I added the word ongoing here, by the way, if you were at Taylor Ruth's excellent talk yesterday, she talked about this idea of masks and, people complaining that, like, the guidance on masks has changed. So therefore, obviously, all of this guidance is bunk. And not understanding that this is science happening in real time. And as we get more data, then we're revising our conclusions. And so that's just one example of how understanding the process of science will augment people's trust in its authority. And sometimes that can come even when the knowledge of the content isn't there. And so this is, I guess, a hypothesis as it pertains to our current moment in history. Then I would love for some social scientists to investigate how education and the process of science impacts attitudes towards science. But over time, I can say that history bears this out, that those who understand the process of science are more likely to appreciate the knowledge it produces. So that's something we need to think about. The process of science is, of course, messy and complicated. We can talk about whether complexity or complex and complicated mean the same thing or not, but in some ways that Avril Lavigne earworm is a bad one to use for complexity because it runs against the point that I'm trying to make. On the other hand, it's a great illustration of the attitude that people have towards complexity that we as science communicators, I think, need to kind of overcome. So I think many people subscribe to what I have termed the Dave fantasy. And if you're old like me, you might remember the movie Dave, which came out in 1993. It's very popular when I was in high school. It's a great movie. It's a movie about a president who has a heart attack under compromising circumstances, and his advisors do not want the public to be made aware of this. So instead of releasing this information, they find this guy who looks exactly like him, this regular guy named Dave, and bring him in to impersonate the president. And Dave, of course, comes in and he is a much better president than the guy that he was replacing, because he has compassion and he has common sense and he can look at the problems and he can see how to fix them, and he's not corrupt and power hungry like all of these politicians around him. And so the Dave fantasy consists of a few tenets. The first is that the solutions to our problems are actually simple. Experts make them needlessly complicated. And a regular person, generally speaking, a regular guy, can see and do what experts can't or won't. And so this attitude pervades all of our culture, not just politics, but our approaches to science as well, as we're beginning to see more and more. And so the solution, I think, is that we need science narratives that acknowledge, celebrate, and teach people to value complexity rather than denying or suppressing it. And so how do we do that? I mean, I don't, in a way, have a lot of practical advice, except to say that pretending science isn't complex is not the answer. There are ways to talk about complex issues in ways that still resonate with people, and my next couple of words will make that point. I was going to show you this video by Katie Mack. I'll show you the first few seconds.
I want to make you dizzy.
There, that way I can stop the screen on a photogenic moment. This is a great example of a narrative that celebrates complexity and uncertainty even. And it starts out with the phrase, "I want to make you dizzy," which is a great opening line. I encourage you to go to YouTube. I'm sure Kiyomi will find the link and put it in the chat box to hear Katie Mack's poem called Disorientation. Katie Mack is a cosmologist, and the point I want to make here is that there are some fields where it may be a lot easier to celebrate complexity than others. So cosmology is one of those sort of like, at least in many circles, it's a warm, fuzzy, feel-good, wow, the universe is so big and wonderful. So it's going to be easier to celebrate complexity, to talk about complexity in that kind of topic, perhaps, than when you're talking about the COVID-19 vaccine. And oh, isn't it wonderful that viruses are so complex and that our immune systems have such complex responses? Probably not. That's probably not going to be the moment where we're glad for the complexity of the universe. But this is where I think people who work in topics that are not considered controversial actually can play a really important role, because if people can begin to hear and understand and appreciate the complexity of science in non-controversial settings, then we avoid what Taylor Ruth talked about yesterday, the backfire effect. Their defenses aren't up, and so they come to understand and accept the complexity of science in a setting that's non-threatening. And then when they're approached with information about science in a different setting that might be more challenging and more controversial, they have a background against which to understand that complexity is part of the scientific process, and it should be part of our narratives. I'm not going to say as much about this, even though it is in some respects the most important. But I think it's important just to mention that we need to respect our audiences enough to believe that they're capable of handling complexity and uncertainty, and that our job as science communicators is really to empower them to do that. And so if the task of science communicators isn't to simplify science for a non-expert audience, as we tend to think of it often, then what is it? What are we doing here? What do you mean by that? Well, I think what we're doing here is we're making science meaningful to non-expert audiences. And so we often tend to assume or think in science that the facts speak for themselves. And as any of the speakers at this conference will have already ably attested, that's clearly not the case. But I've increasingly moved away, and if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me rant about this before, from using the term accessible, making it accessible, making science accessible to a diverse audience, because that implies that you're subtracting something from it. I think what we need to do is add meaning, make the science meaningful. And sometimes that means using simpler language, but it doesn't necessarily need to mean simpler concepts. What it means is connecting those concepts to a context that makes them meaningful and useful and intelligible to the particular audience that you're talking with. So this is a great quote from that I love and use a lot from a Hungarian-American psychologist whose name I'm probably going to pronounce incorrectly. I practiced it before, but now I've been talking for so long I forgot. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Yep, that's it. And he's written a lot about the topic of meaning and really in our personal lives. And what he said is that it derives from the connection of the individual to a tradition, enterprise, and community of practice that lie beyond the self. And so I love this quote because I think it applies equally well to science and where the authority of science comes from. So the authority of science also, as we talked about when we were discussing the scientific process, comes from the connection of the individual scientist to that tradition, enterprise, and community of practice that lie beyond the self. And I think the more we can bring other people into that community in some capacity, the more we can connect them to that tradition and that enterprise, the more authority science will have in our culture. And the way we need to do that is by making the science meaningful to them. So how do stories help? I've been talking a lot about my 4 words. You may have forgotten that the overarching theme here was storytelling. I think stories are a perfect avenue to bring all 4 of these concepts and these words together. If we're going to focus on stories that highlight the process of science, stories situate science in time and place, showing the relationships between ideas and events. That's something that a lecture or a journal article doesn't typically do, but stories do it very well. Complexity. Stories present ideas in a form that is both familiar and highly flexible. And so, unlike in many other formats, in a story, you kind of like the surprise ending or the plot twist, right? So this is a format in which we're a little bit more tolerant of complexity generally. And because there's lots of research out there that shows the same sorts of forms of stories persist across cultures and across time, it gives a familiar element in which to, a familiar context in which to make sense of new information. So it's a way to introduce complexity in a way that is intelligible and non-threatening. The respect between science communicators and their audience. Stories create a personal connection between the teller and the listener. So they're at sort of an intrinsic respect established through the act of storytelling that may not be the case in more of a lecture format. And lastly, stories provide the context to make scientific content meaningful for diverse audiences. So that's what stories do. They create meaning, and that's what we should be trying to do as scientific communicators. And these 4 themes and the use of stories to advance these 4 themes in scientific communication, I think is the way forward as we try to navigate this idea that experts are elitist. This is a way that we can talk with people and convey expert knowledge to them without creating that perceived power differential. We're inviting them into the conversation. We're not saying that everyone has equal information, equal access to information, but we're inviting them into a conversation that may have different meanings for different people, but it has meaning for everyone. And the more people we have in that conversation, the greater cultural authority science will have. So I want to highlight 2 more talks that you should be sure to check out on this theme of storytelling. So Dai Shizuka, these are both available on the UNL SciComm YouTube channel. So they were pre-recorded talks. Dai Shizuka gives a little bit of a how-to tell a good science story, and then he provides a great example in his short talk, Storytelling, Bringing Life to Science. And then Melinda Smith also talks about, in her longer talk, using storytelling to convey complex concepts, but in simple words. So I think those are both great companion pieces that sort of talk about storytelling at a level of detail that I couldn't get into it here, that you should be sure to check out on the YouTube channel. And with that, I will thank you and let you know that you can follow me on Twitter at SciTalker. And if you want to hear more discussions about issues like this, you can follow the Science with Friends podcast on Twitter as well, at Sci with Friends, and check us out on whatever platform you get your podcasts.
All right, thank you so much, Jocelyn. I think I should not be allowed to moderate your talk because I just want to sit and talk to you like forever. I was really interested in your frame. So I have a frame that I use when I'm talking about how DEI should be integrated. It shouldn't be like a separate thing. And the frame that I use is respect, agency, and support.
I like it.
So I feel like we should like write something about how our frames are the same. Also, I have a very geeky quote, and if anybody knows what it is and emails me, I will send you a geeky prize. No data speaks for itself. Data just lies there. People speak. The idiom speaks for itself almost always translates as, if I don't say something about this, no one will notice. Sloppy thinking. So if anybody knows what that is from, it's from a book that I have read through 3 physical copies and finally bought an ebook. I will send you a prize. And so now I'm going to ask the first question that was asked was by Carol, and she once says, so should we operationalize or harmonize the term expertise to ensure we do not presume those participating in the disclosure are not considered expertise or a non-expert? These titles seem very political and based on who knows who or promotes who when they are sought out to participate in certain forums. How do we reconcile such realities, especially in the media, who oftentimes can galvanize the largest audience?
Ooh, so much to think about there. So many great questions. And so kind of what I'm taking away from that is the idea that, yeah, not all experts are going to agree, right? And so it is easy sometimes for people with a particular agenda to find an expert to support their viewpoint, and then despite their general distrust of expertise, say, hey, look, we found an expert that said X, Y, or Z. And another aspect of this is that because experts disagree, then sometimes that in itself is used to undermine the authority of science, to say, hey, you know, people have different opinions within the scientific community, so therefore my opinion outside of the scientific community is just as valid as one of yours, because even scientists don't agree. And that's where I would come back to the word process. I think understanding how the process of science works and the collaborative nature of science, the systematic nature of science, it is just the key to science literacy. And this is a big project. This is not something that is going to happen just because of the efforts of a few scientific communicators. This is about science education and infrastructure and all of that. But I think the more we can promote understanding of the scientific process, the less problematic it will be to talk about what this or that expert says, because people will understand the way that the scientific process works systematically and how experts debate and discuss these sorts of things and adjudicate these issues ultimately.
Great. So I think we have time for you to answer one more question before we have to switch everything over to the next speaker. So I'm going to ask Jeffrey's question. The anti-science crowd justifies their stance against expertise by repeating the phrase, the science is always changing. Although argued in bad faith, how do we address this valid charge that what is true today will be overturned tomorrow by a future discovery? And I know that you addressed that somewhat in your talk, but do you have anything more you'd like to say on that?
The process. I'm coming back to that word again and again. And it is true. I guess we need, as science communicators, to sort of take charge of that narrative and say, instead of the science is always changing, therefore why do we pay attention to it? We kind of flip that around and say, yeah, the science is always changing. You know why? Because we are always working for you to get you the best, most current, most robust information. And that's why the science is always changing, because we don't just come to an answer and then sit back and assume we're right. You know, we keep working on it. We keep working on it. So if we can just change the tone of the way we talk about the changing science and updating scientific knowledge, I think that helps a lot. It's not a negative, it's actually a positive.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.